Hello, everyone, and I hope everyone had a great holiday vacation, although I'm sure a lot of the residents were working. Welcome to our May social medicine rounds. We are really excited to have the panel of folks that we have on board for today. And I'm particularly excited about this conversation because I think that there are different ways that we are approaching and thinking about this topic. And I'm hopeful that it will help others to really think about their advocacy around this space as well. We provocatively titled this session, Truly It's the Guns, Gun Violence Advocacy for Healthcare Workers. And I would add in there community members, because we do this work in participation with our community members at all times. So just for those who are joining and who are new to this space, I want to introduce myself. I'm Stella Sappho. I'm an HIV primary care physician. I'm the founder of Just Equity for Health, and I have the pleasure of being the social medicine lead hosting our rounds for the 2022-2023 year. And social medicine rounds are really an opportunity for us to connect our staff, faculty, trainees, and community members with leaders who are dealing with various issues, often social and structural determinant of health issues that impact the health and wellness of the Bronx community, but really also of kind of national settings as well. So we bring in a series of topics that cover everything from a historical review of the Young Lords to opioid overdose prevention, to conversations around COVID and conversations about criminal justice reform. And we have a few of those here. If you're interested and you're someone who's new to this space, feel free to click onto the QR code up top to learn more about the previous rounds that we've had and to kind of see what resources you can learn from there. I am particularly excited about today. I've been really looking forward to it, in part because of a kind of unfortunate reality that every day there are more stories of the need for this topic and for us to really think about how we can do better at this work. And so I'm going to introduce our three speakers, and then we will get into conversation. And our rounds today will be a discussion panel that will follow each speaker is presenting and introducing a little bit about themselves and their work and their kind of orientation to this topic, and then us having an open discussion. And because of that, we will continue to share the resources as we do in our chat, but we will also be asking that you please send in any questions or put your hand up, and we'll call on you to make sure that you're able to just be in conversation as well. So I'm going to begin with Dr. Sonali Rajan, who is an associate professor in the Department of Health and Behavioral Studies at Teachers College, Columbia University. She holds a secondary faculty appointment in the Department of Epi at the Mailman School of Public Health, and she's currently the Senior Associate Director of the Edmund W. Gordon Institute for Urban and Minority Education. Dr. Rajan is a school violence prevention expert who studies gun violence and adverse childhood experiences. She holds faculty affiliations with the CDC-funded Columbia Center for Injury Science and Prevention and the Columbia Scientific Union for the Reduction of Gun Violence, as well as the Columbia Population Research Center and Trauma-Free NYC and Digital Futures Institute. She currently co-produces Research for Solutions, a podcast hosted by the Media and Social Change Lab at Teachers College, which is devoted to amplifying creative and evidence-based solutions to the persistence of gun violence. So welcome, Dr. Rajan. Next, we have Dr. Cedric Dark, MD, MPH, FAC, EP, who earned his medical degree from New York University School of Medicine. He holds a master's degree from the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University in Health Policy and Management. He's trained in emergency medicine at George Washington University, where he served as chief resident, and is an associate professor in the Henry J. N. Taub Department of Emergency Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. He currently is on the board of Directors, for Doctors for America, the Board of Trustees for Semester at Sea, and he's the medical editor-in-chief for the monthly publication ACEP Now. Dr. Dark's media experience includes print, radio, podcast, and television, including outlets such as NPR, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and BBC World News. His policy experience includes work for the United States House of Representatives, the Kaiser Family Foundation, and the Joe Biden campaign. Finally, but last but definitely not least, we have Ian Ellis James, or William Electric Black, and he goes by Electric, who is a 7-time Emmy Award-winning writer for his work on Sesame Street between 1992 and 2002. In 2021, Electric wrote, directed, and produced 7 animated shorts. He's also produced numerous children's shows and is head writer and executive producer for many other projects as well. Electric launched his Gunplay series at the Theater for New York City with Welcome Home, Sonny T. a play that spotlighted two significant factors driving the current epidemic of gun violence: the social impact of alienation and the unemployment on young Black males, and the declining influence of Black ministers as a force of stability in affected neighborhoods. As part of this work, he's author of a series of pre-K early reader books on gun violence prevention and awareness titled "A Gun Is Not Fun." With that in mind, I would like to turn over to our speakers. Welcome each of you, and we'll begin our conversation with Dr. Rajan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sappho, for the invitation to be here, and for all of you for taking time on a Tuesday afternoon to engage with us in this discussion. I'm just going to spend a few minutes, like very briefly, giving you an overview of my work and how I see the issue of gun violence prevention more generally, and where my kind of headspace sits. I know, thank you, Dr. Sappho, for the very lovely and kind introduction. I always say this just to sort of help explain how I see this issue. So my work really sits at the intersection of public health and education. So you heard that I'm a faculty at Teachers College at Columbia University, and also in our School of Public Health in the Department of Epidemiology. And I share that in large part because the way in which I see and think about the issue of gun violence prevention is very much at the intersection of health and learning. So broadly speaking, my work really sits in a field that we call generally as school health. And that means I'm really interested in the health and well-being of children, and essentially what do we need to do to support them in schools and also out of schools to ensure that they're able to learn and thrive and take tests and engage with their peers and do all the things we expect children to do during childhood, but also preparing them for adulthood. So you'll hear my 7-year-old here in the background. I apologize in advance for that. So I say all this to say that it seems very obvious, right, that health and learning are inextricably linked, that you need to feel good and sleep well and feel safe in order to go about your day. But unfortunately, that is not the case for many, many kids in this country. And it's not something that we actually actively engage or embrace in the systems that inform our day-to-day, everything from policy to our public schooling system to access to healthcare and everything in between. So broadly speaking, that's where my work sits. And many years ago, I co-authored a paper with my one of my very best friends, who actually was my former college roommate, and she's a bioinformatics professor. And so she and I took a whole lot of CDC data, about 10 years worth of data, and we looked to see what are, and this is Kelly Ruggles. She is just so brilliant. But we looked at all of these data, 10 years worth of data, to try and understand some patterns. So what are behaviors or experiences that kids are going through that might correlate very strongly with gun possession? And I say gun possession largely because the science is very clear that gun possession is directly correlated with an incidence of gun violence, which feels a little obvious, but certainly worth underscoring. Now, I say that to say, so in this work, we looked at teenagers and we looked at all these behavioral correlates, and some things emerged from our work that might feel very obvious. So youth who are struggling with poor mental health certainly was something that emerged, but I'll tell you the thing that really sat with me. And again, this is a paper we wrote several years ago, almost 10 years ago at this point. The kids who were more likely to carry a firearm were the kids who were experiencing violence in other ways, kids who physically were not feeling safe at school or on their way to and from school, kids who had maybe been experiencing unsafe environments in their communities. Those were the experiences that appeared to be driving this idea of gun possession among at least teenagers. This was a national representative sample of teenagers. Now, you're probably sitting here saying, well, that seems really obvious. And again, I always joke around, joking is not the right term, but I always say, this isn't rocket science, right? So much of the work we do in this field is actually feels very obvious, but it's important that we're using the best quality data to draw some of those connections. So after we wrote that paper, I really just was fascinated by this notion that, well, if kids fundamentally don't feel safe and they are going to school and they don't feel safe and they're coming home and they don't feel safe, then how are we going to expect them to do anything else? So you can talk about learning loss, and you can talk about good eating habits and the need for important sleep, but none of those things are going to happen if kids feel that their sense of well-being is constantly being threatened. Now, this was about in 2014 that we wrote that paper, and ever since 2015, we have seen a significant uptick in gun violence in this country. As we all know, we have specifically seen an uptick in gun violence in K through 12 schools around the country. And so I have really devoted my career to understanding this issue in all different ways, thinking about both the prevalence of the issue, who is impacted, and no surprise there. Children of color, specifically Black children in this country, are significantly more likely. Okay, you can say hi to my little guy here. Hold on, we're gonna strategically do this. Okay, there you go. So we call this work-life balance, you guys. Okay, so Black children.
We accept all of it, no worries.
Yeah, there we go. So Black children in particular are significantly more likely to be exposed to gun violence in comparison to their white peers. And all of that is happening at the same time that we have systems in place that are not actually attending to what kids need in the aftermath of exposure to this kind of violence. So that's when I started thinking a lot about what are we doing in schools? How are we responding to the anticipation of this kind of violence? We are arming our teachers. We have bulletproof backpacks. We have metal detectors. We have all sorts of safety strategies in place that are largely driven by a complete lack of evidence. So a couple of years ago, one of my very good friends and colleagues who I do a lot of this work with, Dr. Charlie Brandis, who's here at Columbia with me, he and I secured funding from the National Institutes of Health to pursue a study, which we're right now knee deep in. I just came from a meeting about our data collection about an hour ago. But we are right now, and thankfully we have funds now, right? This is also kind of new, funding that's devoted to the science and study of gun violence. But in our work, we are looking at a national sample of K through 12 public schools. We have about 700 schools in our sample, and we are using what we call a case control study design. And I'm happy to talk about that more in a little bit, where we're actually evaluating, well, which of these safety strategies in our school environments are working and which aren't? And are they effective at deterring gun violence or reducing the lethality of gun violence once it occurs? We're also in a separate study funded by the CDC exploring, well, what is the mental health burden that children and teachers and principals are currently carrying in schools that have experienced this kind of violence, but also schools that haven't but might be anticipating it. So very broadly speaking, that's how I think about this work and this issue, really trying to underscore, and I say this all the time, but I'll reiterate it here, that schools are not just supposed to be places that are free from violence, although that should be a given for every school. They should also be space where children can thrive. And I think that as our goal should be where we think about what prevention of gun violence specifically in schools look like and what our responsibility to children in particular is. So I will pause there, and
That's
I look
excellent.
forward to talking with you guys more.
Thank you for setting that groundwork and kind of continuing on the theme of how we're thinking about youth and gun violence. I'm going to turn it over to Electric.
Hello, and I said salutations before, so I like that word. So I kind of deal in words, and I deal in characters, and I deal in stories, and we love telling stories. That's kind of been part of us, the world. I got involved with acting and writing and directing in college, and very excited about that world. Of course, parents get nervous. They don't want you to go in that direction. No, come back from that side. But, with their blessing, after I went off for a year to be an economics major, I came back and I said, I had the theater bug in high school. And so my parents were like, okay, go for it, hang out, do your thing. So my thing, started in theater. And then, I got into, writing for children's TV, children's programming, which was pretty amazing because the programming also involves, sort of curriculum content and education and helping kids be the best that they can be. So with that said, I was still doing theater, but now all of a sudden I was doing, writing for Sesame Street. And then other PBS programs came along and they had curriculum content. And I was like, wow, this is great. So I started to then marry that curriculum content and that way of thinking and trying to help kids with what I was doing. So I was writing plays at the time. And in I love the date 2012, 2014, I think it was mentioned earlier, because a lot of us have been working in this field, not just today. And when I teach at Tisch, I also teach script writing. I always tell the students about stories. Stories have already started. Like this gun violence didn't just start like now. We're like, wow, oh my goodness, guns. The story is back here and we're sort of catching up to it and it's gonna keep going. So I caught up to it when I was writing these plays and I said, I'm gonna write a series of plays called gun plays. And each play is sort of an inner city, family issue dealing with guns. They're only connected by guns and gun violence. And that was my sort of first out of the gate, marrying sort of this education content world, curriculum world with storytelling to do something about gun violence. Because I was like, it's out of control. And especially as it was mentioned, kids of color were being impacted, right? So I was like, okay, let me, try to do something. Let me also not just have a play, come out, see my play. I'm going to have talkbacks. So I had people in the medical field, clergy, educators, after the plays, they would speak about gun violence, the impact, and what was going on with it, what they were doing. This is back in 2014. I started the plays, a series of plays, and the plays are actually going to be published now, and they're coming out in August. So I was like, wow. So it's kind of good and bad. Whenever I start to talk, I'd be like, yes, I'm glad to talk about what I do in gun violence, but I wish I wasn't here to talk about it, if you know what I mean. So the gun plays came out, people saw them, but they weren't really for little kids in terms of what I was doing with children's TV. Children's TV, I was dealing with like 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds. Those are more tweens and teens and their parents. So I finished the 5 plays and gun violence was still going on like it is today. It was, getting more and more and more and more out of control. So I started to put on my educational TV, children's programming hat and think about what I could do for the little ones, 5 and 6-year-olds. And at first people were like, wait, what are you talking about? You're gonna talk to them about guns and gun violence and what? And I was like, well, kids 12, 13-year-olds, they're like shooting each other. So are we gonna wait for that age to talk to them about it, do something about it, try to run interference, prevention, do something? No. I said, you can, and from my experience, it's writing with children's TV and children's program. 5-year-olds they're 4-year-olds, they're really smart. Like the idea with Sesame Street was not to dumb down any kind of writing and scripts. And that's why it's been on for 60 some odd years. Really, kids can embrace a lot and kids deal with a lot. And so I think if we give them the power, and this is where my "a gun is not fun" idea comes in, and other books, "A gun is not the answer." If we start when they're 4 or 5, and stay with them when they're 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 up until 5th grade, what would that look like? If we go into a school, programming, and we come in, and I come in with storytelling and puppets and characters and music, and I really, with a great research team, as some of the people today are here on the panel, and other people, if I came in with a fabulous research team, boom, and we got it. We got some of the research that all of you are doing. We put it in there and we said, this is going to work. And that's what we should do. Imagine that research team. And imagine then if you're in a school for 5 years, pilot program, you get that with the research, the data collection, and you prove, yes, indeed, you can get these kids on board and they can have the power. Because right now, as I said, the story keeps going. We seem to have failed them. There are 13-year-olds shooting 13-year-olds, and there are kids being shot at schools when somebody has a big assault. But we are failing the kids. Hello. And so I'm tired of failing the kids. And if we give the kids the power, maybe they will save themselves. So that's what I propose, that if we give them the knowledge, the education, the tools, the strategy, that they are the ones that will be aware of what the guns can do, the history of guns, why do we use guns? Why do we need guns? So as the age rises, right, we can give them more information. They can take it. They can understand it. They can write essays as they get older. The early age is sort of sing-songy, a gun is not fun. When you see a gun, call 911. Don't. So, but if we build on that and give them that strength and power, it's like I'm a little kid and I come over and I say, well, I have a peanut allergy and I'm not supposed to have peanuts in your house. If a kid comes over and says, hey, I'm not supposed to be around guns, and if there's a gun in the house, we really need to talk about it. And that kid's 5. Whoa. And that kid goes to this house and that house. And the transfer of knowledge, you see, that kids can bring and have an impact on us, the rest of the world, and on, and et cetera, as the great Sly Stone once said in one of his songs. Shh. We're going to change. We're going to change the society out there. And that's my spiel so far. So I'm going to turn it over.
Thank you, Electric. Thank you. I love that. I love that perspective. I think if Dr. Rajan is sharing about the kind of research perspective, and you're sharing about what it looks like to directly work with potential end users, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Dark to talk a little bit about some of the advocacy and policy as well. And as you're listening, if you're listening or you're thinking these are really different perspectives, that's exactly the point, because I think that these solutions have to be myriad. So Dr. Dark.
Thanks very much for having me on, and thanks to Dr. Rajan and Electric for joining me on this panel. It's great to hear everybody's perspective. I want to take a little bit from what each of them said and talk about how that works in relation to what I do for a living. So Electric talks to kids. He's trying to get kids to put guns down or to not pick them up in the first place. My goal and what I like to do is try to talk to the people who are supposed to be the adults in the room, the policymakers, the people that actually are the decision makers. And the way I do that is by trying to use data, the data that Dr. Rajan is using and creating, and people that are in injury prevention, and use that data, combine it with stories and narratives to see if we can affect change in the advocacy space. So by way of background, I'm an emergency room doctor. Just a few days ago, I was walking by one of our trauma bays and saw a person that was dead, blood on the floor, and they were zipping them up in the body bag. And I was like, oh, what's going on there? And my colleague was like, oh, traumatic arrest, gunshot wound, and nonchalantly walked by, because that's the world I live in. The world I live in is where people show up in the ER shot every single day. We probably get about 600 people like that in our emergency department every year. About 10% of those people die. And most of that is sort of that interpersonal conflict, inner city gun violence. What we tend to miss out on, a large portion of that, is suicide, and suicide being the predominant form of what we would like to call gun violence or gun deaths in the United States. So that's another topic that needs to be discussed as well. But my background, as you heard, is really about the advocacy space. It's about what can we do away from the bedside to actually save the lives of people that are not only our patients in that one-to-one interaction, but also what we can do with our communities. And the way we can do that is by having a greater influence than we can with an individual patient. So my foray into this kind of goes back to maybe 2018, even though I had been looking at evidence-based health policies for a variety of items. My interest in gun violence and gun policy sparked in 2018 after the NRA came out and tweeted and said doctors should stay in their lane and they shouldn't really talk about gun policy because they don't know what they're talking about. Well, of course, the NRA has no idea what they're talking about, because folks like me and other people that have similar interests, we've trained. You heard I did a master's in public health at Columbia. In doing that, I did it in the concentration of health policy. I spent time working on Capitol Hill to understand, how this stuff actually takes place in that real life environment. And in what I do now, I'm on the board of Doctors for America, which is a 501c3. And if any of you want to join, please do. We have a group that's active in promoting gun violence prevention and talking about advocacy, whether it's to state legislators or to federal legislators on specific policies. And so that's where I come into play on that. The other interesting thing is, and I'm probably dissimilar from a lot of people in the gun violence space in that I am a gun owner as well. I never intended to be one, but one day my house got robbed. My wife, being that we're in Texas, went out to Academy, which is, like a local sporting goods store, came back like the same day with a shotgun and a 40 caliber handgun, which, I pulled out of my safe just for this talk today. Otherwise, it stays in the safe because I have an 8-year-old and I don't want him anywhere near it. So, that's one of the things that we know when we look at firearms policy saves lives, right? Keeping firearms away from people under the age of 21 and child access prevention laws. And so after the NRA made their little tweet, what they actually did was they said that the American College of Physicians had overstepped their bounds and they were saying things that weren't necessarily true based on the science. And what they used for the science was this report from the RAND Corporation called The Science of Gun Policy. Now, RAND's a very well-respected DC think tank. They do extensive amounts of research, and they compile it. They're now in the 3rd generation of this report that was just published this year. And there are several things that, lo and behold, the NRA ignored that actually are effective, even if some of the things that, the NRA wanted to say are not effective, they wanted to tout. And I'm going to mention them briefly, and then I'll shoot it back to you, Dr. Sefo, so we can get into the discussion in the Q&A. But I'd be remiss if I didn't actually mention those things that after studying this for several years, and I actually have a book coming out, I'm not sure when exactly, but it's called Under the Gun right now, tentatively. It talks about these policies, and I try to tell a policy story through literature, which, you can tell me how good I do with that in a few months to a year, I guess. But when we look at these things, right, minimum age requirements reduce things like suicides. If we talk about prohibiting people with mental illness from having firearms, that may reduce violent crime in some instances. If we talk about prohibiting people with domestic violence convictions and not only preventing them from buying new guns, but also taking the guns they already have away from them, we can save lives of usually women from intimate partner homicide. And so that's a very important technique that we could do as well. We talk about background checks. Everyone's heard of this. Our country is universally in favor of them. If you talk to voters about it, we just haven't acted on it. But if we do background checks, that again reduces things like firearm homicides. If we talk about licensing and permits, some states require that, others don't. Those reduce things like suicides. Again, this is a big problem on the suicide space, not just the homicide space. If we institute waiting periods can save lives as well. And the interesting thing that I found about doing this, and the reason I focus this from an evidence-based standpoint, is that there's caveats with some of this stuff. So if we have a waiting period of at least 24 hours, we're going to save lives. But if that waiting period lasts longer than 7 days, you might actually lose lives. And this is particularly in a group of people that are being stalked by other people, and so it's not as simple as, the title of this talk and saying, let's just take all the guns away. It's the guns. Sometimes there's other things that factor into this. And we can discuss this a little bit further too. And there's a couple of things as well that I think are really important that we get rid of. And I think some of us have seen this in the media, because 2 laws like concealed carry and stand your ground will result in more people dying, right? You're in a fender bender. Next thing you know, you get in an argument with the person that ran into the back of you. They see you twitch a certain way. They pull out their gun and shoot you, fearing for their life. And now, someone or multiple people are dead. It's a stupid thing that we allow. And if we are going to actually try to focus on the concept of saving people's lives by using policy, by using evidence-based policy, that's just a few items that we could discuss. And things that I can tell you based on the science are proven to work. But let me go ahead and give that back to you, Dr. Sefo, and happy to engage in this conversation.
Thank you so much. And I loved when we had our pre-call for this with all 3 of us. One of the things that Dr. Darks did say to me was, I don't like the title. The title isn't right. So I appreciate you bringing that up again, because I think that this topic deserves a degree of disagreement, right? I want us to be provocative in thinking about what it looks like to really work towards solutions. And so I'll actually turn to you, Dr. Dark, for my first question, which is, it's interesting because many of us are calling in from New York. Many of us are New Yorkers. You live in a state in Texas, which is becoming like synonymous with mass shootings and gun violence. And I'm curious about your perspectives as someone who is from Texas, who owns a gun, who does this advocacy work, of just kind of helping us to kind of contextualize, like, is it as bad as it seems? Like, what is particularly happening in that area of the country, where we're kind of, weekly hearing about things that are happening?
It is as bad as it seems, and it's getting worse, I would say. Quite frankly, when you think about it, and I won't name names, but the governor of our state has presided over many mass shootings, and in that time frame has signed lots of legislation that has loosened restrictions on firearms, most notably and most recently what we call permitless carry. When we talk about concealed carry laws, at least in Texas a few years ago, if you wanted to conceal carry your firearm, you had to apply, get a concealed carry license, go through some training to get that. And then there's states that once you pass that training, the state has to issue it. We call that shall issue states. Others are may issue, where let's say maybe you pass all the baseline rules to get a firearm, but the local sheriff knows that every night you're at the bar drunk and you stumble home and maybe you beat your spouse, but they haven't convicted you of anything yet. Maybe the sheriff has some discretion in saying, oh, you probably shouldn't have a concealed carry license, right? That's a may issue state. And then what we have now, and more states are actually implementing this, is what's called permitless carry, where just because the Constitution says that the people should have the ability to bear arms, that you don't even need any kind of training or licensure or permit to carry a firearm on you in a concealed manner. So things are getting worse, and I think we've seen this not only in Texas, we've seen this in Tennessee recently, and they are one of those states that have that sort of permitless carry issue as well. And then, I mean, Houston's a weird place. Houston's is a place, I don't know. I don't think people didn't run red lights in New York. First of all, there's not too many people driving like their own cars in New York, because you have the subway and the buses and stuff. But people run red lights. They run into each other. They're terrible drivers here. And this road rage thing is real. Like, there were people that were in a traffic jam leaving an Astros baseball game a couple years ago, and someone got pissed off, just started shooting into the other car. It's ridiculous stuff that I think is enabled by the regulations, or the lack thereof regulations, that we have around firearms.
Over to Dr. Rajan and Electric. As folks who are in New York, I think sometimes we get very comfortable in a state that has more restrictive gun laws. Are there spaces for local advocacy and work that we should be pushing on as, Bronx community members and clinicians, that can actually improve some of the conditions that we've just been describing? And maybe Dr. Rajan.
Yeah, and so Dr. Sava, just so I can clarify your question, you're
Yeah.
talking specifically at the policy level with regard to gun access, or?
I would say at the policy level, but more general advocacy, right? Like, I think that we tend to think I'll speak on kind of on behalf of us, and I'll speak from a political perspective. Sometimes when we talk about politics, folks tend to think, well, New York is like a blue state, so there's nothing more for us to do. And yet, if you, go into pockets of the city, for instance, of the state, for instance, there's advocacy needed around abortion rights and other things that we tend to just assume that we have. And so similarly, we've just heard Dr. Dark describe Texas as kind of like the wild, wild west, if you will. And I think there's kind of some comfort that folks in New York can take, in thinking like, well, we have very restrictive gun laws. Are there spaces that we need to be thinking about kind of pushing into, that we need to be aware of?
Yes, thank you for clarifying. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure I understood the question. So I have lots of thoughts on this, and I will try to summarize my quick thoughts. So first and foremost, New York does have strict gun laws, but they could be stricter. And I'll just be really honest about that. They're not actually as strict as we would like, and as we've seen with the more recent Supreme Court rulings around public carry of firearms. We have some work to do, and I am concerned about the direction some of our laws are taking us. I will talk, I think, just the challenge here in the United States is that, there's no one at the state line checking to see if a firearm has crossed that state line. So I'll give you a great example. There is a sort of a misnomer that this talking point, it's an incorrect talking point, but it gets used a lot, which is that Chicago has strict gun laws, but oh my goodness, look at all that firearm violence. Well, I can tell you that a large percentage of the firearms in Chicago come from Indiana, which is like a 20-minute drive across the way. And Indiana has very loose gun laws. And so there is really excellent research, and some that my colleagues have done as well, which has shown very, very clearly that more permissive gun laws is directly associated with all different kinds of gun violence. So suicide, as you just heard Dr. Dark talking about, mass shootings more generally, community-based violence, and specifically shootings in K-12 schools. So we know that the permissive gun laws are problematic. So one thing I say from an advocacy perspective, and I do this all of the time, which is to say that I call my elected officials. These are constituents who I vote for, right? Whose my taxes contribute to their office. And I call all the time. They probably block my number at this point, but I'm not unkind in what I say ever, but I do call and say, this is good, and here's how we can do better. So from a legislative perspective, calling and really engaging at that local level, right? It matters what our school board, it matters what our public school budget looks like. It matters that in New York City, we spend over half of our quote school safety budget on police and schools. That's not a data-informed solution, but yet here we are spending $200 million a year on that. So I think it's really important that as just citizens, right, members of our community, that we are advocating for what I would call evidence-informed practices. Now, I get this question a lot, where you see my little one over here. People say, well, you're a mom and you're speaking emotionally about this, right? I get, this is a criticism that, we hear a lot. And yes, I'm a parent, but you know what? I'm also a scientist. And so I always try to say, as advocates in our space, to really, on this issue, just like many others, especially on this issue, we really, really want to see data-informed solutions. And so some of the solutions that are out there, we just don't know, right? There isn't enough research. I think something that's really important to note is for 25 years, there was no federal funding, right, devoted to the science and study of this issue. There's a literal, I'm quoting a colleague, but there was a lost generation of research. So I was looking at a statistic just before this to try and share. This was on the Giffords organization. I think they estimate something like, we spend right now, it's like $50 per firearm death a year or something like that in terms of federal research money. But by comparison, cancer, obesity, all sorts of other issues get thousands of dollars per death per year. I'm not saying we should take away money from other health issues. I think we should invest more in this issue, which is currently the leading cause of death among children and teens in the United States. So from a advocacy perspective, absolutely, we can do better on the policy front. I think the bar is very low. And the good news in our favor here is there's amazing research, great, rigorous, well-conducted research by really prominent individuals who have thought a lot about this, who work with gun owners, who work with gun violence survivors, who are working with school nurses and social workers and physicians, really trying to identify what do policy solutions look like, and we should talk to them. There's lots of other things we can advocate for in terms of like just investments in our communities that break cycles of disenfranchisement. I mean, why do people, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, right? Why are children carrying firearms, right? It's a last resort. No child is actively going to pick up a firearm with the intent to hurt themselves or someone else until, for no reason, right? That we have systematically failed them over and over and over again. So I always try to go back to the research. Green space is gun violence prevention. Affordable housing is gun violence prevention. Investing in universal school-based violence prevention programs that focus on pro-social skill development. That is an example of violence prevention. Disciplinary strategies that aren't punitive and aren't exclusionary and aren't racist. That is an example of gun violence prevention. So when we think about what gun violence prevention looks like, I know this isn't popular given the sort of way we hear people talk about public health, particularly in the wake of the pandemic, but like, yeah, good public health means investing at all levels, starting like way, way, way before we even think about someone picking up a firearm to hurt themselves or someone else. We also need to reduce access for prescribed users at that point of sale, and certainly at the point of use for potential harm, but there's like so many opportunities for intervention way, way, way before that we are just like, there's no creativity around that, but the research exists. And this is what so anyway, sorry. I'm
No,
going off
that's
my
brilliant. That's
soapbox here,
brilliant.
but
You took us to church.
yeah. So this is the hill that I will die on. But there's so much more we could do. Like, I think, right, when we talk about school safety, we talk about like this. School safety is like a whole gamut of things when you think about what children need. And we're so like stuck here on like, I don't know, after Uvalde, Ted Cruz is talking about like doors and like windows. And I'm like, oh my God, that's like such a narrow, myopic way of thinking about this. Like, where we can be so much more expansive and in ways that are frankly apolitical, right? Improving and investing in green space, which is work that my colleagues have done, showing these place-based interventions. This is not a political issue. This is just about investing in communities. And guess what? That kind of investment works.
Yeah, it's a human issue.
I just think we need to like reimagine, like we need to flip the conversation over and like be like, look, we have so much more we can offer solution wise here. And we're not doing that. So, okay.
I think that's really brilliant. And I think it makes me immediately want to turn to electric, because I think you are doing, part of the reason why we invited you is because you're approaching this, I think, in a way that most of us don't even think of, and so I'd be interested in your perspective as a New York City person, like, in terms of advocacy locally that we could all be thinking about investing in.
Well, I think you got to invest in the kids. So that's my whole thing. And, give them what they need. And so that's what I propose. Look, we have these, we're not doing anything. We have a couple of little things that we put out there like Band-Aids. We can't keep track of the guns. One state has one rule, another state has, you've heard that. The guns are here. We are going to live with the guns. That's my thing. Nobody really is doing anything, or we know what they should be doing and they're not doing anything. So I'm like, that's it for me. I'm not even going to deal with that. But the pilots, they're going to keep churning and spinning. Great. And that's not happening for me. I want to go in with that child. You see, the other day I was at Starbucks, not to advertise Starbucks, but I was there. And a gentleman, I didn't know him. There was a little kid kind of hanging out waiting, right? And the kid had a Spider-Man t-shirt on. And the guy looked at the kid and he goes, hey, you're a big guy. And the kid was like, oh, I'm not really big. The man said, yes, you are. And he said, you're also a superhero. It's not just that Spider-Man guy on your shirt. You see, and that is what's going to change things. If we we invest in them and get the kid to understand they are somebody, they are the ones that are going to change what's happening out here. We obviously got to help them see that and do that and, go to our grave trying to get that happening. But if they get it, then it's going to change. We are not getting it. We have really changed like nothing. The story is worse than it was in 2012, 2014. There are more numbers out there and statistics and information. So my thing is, we got to invest in those kids. So it's not just like this program I'm talking about. It's a campaign. It has to be this big, you see. Yeah, remember cigarette smoking? There was commercials. They're still on TV. Don't smoke. Where are those commercials? Where are the billboards in front of schools to put things there that the kids can get, what belongs in a backpack, for example? A billboard in front of a school that gets funded that says an apple belongs there, a pencil, but does a gun belong in your backpack in school? Now, if a kid sees that billboard when they're 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, that alone, I do believe, could help save some kids. If I see it on TV, if I see it on a subway and the subway has these things about guns and kids and safety, if I see it everywhere, if I see LeBron and Oprah and I see Biden and Obama, and if I see people bombarding us, the kids, 24/7, about gun violence, but not just for a day, for a long period of time. My thing is, we got to be in the trenches with the kids for a long time to break the violent cycle.
So let me ask you, I'm really curious about this because we hear stories all the time of, Sandy Hook, Uvalde, the Colorado shootings. Like there's just big sensationalized stories. And I'm interested from your different perspectives of how those contribute to or detract from the kind of focused attention that you've all described as needed to really push forward research or policy or a storytelling and narrative change campaign. I can imagine on the one hand that those mass shootings may just kind of be so sensationalized that people kind of tune out. And on the other hand, I can imagine that one could argue that they're actually really helpful to galvanize individuals and galvanize community members to want to move forward change. But I'm just curious as to where you would all locate, the kind of impact of the reality that there's more and more big stories daily that are coming out that feels like a deluge, really, and how that can be used, or maybe how that's kind of detracting from the different efforts that we're all describing. And anyone can go ahead and start.
I'd like to jump in on this one because this is a both and answer. What you're saying. Number one, on the one side, mass shootings, and let's put this into perspective. Mass shootings, when we talk about the number of people killed by firearms, there's around 500 a year in most recent estimates. Compare that to the number of homicides, which is like 19,000, or the number of suicides, which is maybe 24,000. There are actually, and I was shocked to find this out, there are more people killed by police by a firearm than there are mass shooting victims killed by a firearm. But what do we see on TV? It's Uvalde. It's, who got shot at the shopping mall, who got shot in the church, who got shot wherever. Now, there is that double-edged sword to it, because on the one hand, it can galvanize people. It can garner interest in, especially in the advocacy community, to get people to stand up and to say, hey, we got to stop this. It, gets people to put on shirts like this that say enough or end gun violence or whatever. But at the same time, what you mentioned is it does ignore what I like to call the daily trickle of gun violence, the stuff that I see in my ED every day, which is brown and black kids that get shot and killed, or shot and maimed and survive and become angry. And as Electric was saying, participate in that cycle of violence, because now they're going to go out and retaliate against somebody. And that largely gets ignored. It ignores the huge number of people that kill themselves by suicide. And I've literally in my career can remember seeing 2 patients that have been shot attempting to kill themselves via suicide attempt. One was when I was in residency and I saw this person in the ICU. The other one was a couple weeks ago. And I saw a guy who killed himself on, actually, it was Mother's Day. And, left his wife alone. Luckily, I guess, fortunately, maybe he didn't have children, because that would be a horrific day to kill yourself, I would think. But, we ignore that. The news isn't running those stories. So we don't see a large portion of the deaths that occur every single day. And I think people not seeing it is a big problem. I think Electric is right. We need to be flooded with this. We need to know that this is a real problem. And not only a problem in urban communities with Black and brown kids, this is a problem of middle-aged white men that are shooting themselves. And these are a large portion of the people that are the most, the fiercest advocates for the Second Amendment. Maybe if they figured out, oh, I'm likely to kill myself or to kill myself and my family, maybe they might come up with some solutions, or at least be willing to talk about some solutions.
Thank you. Death by suicide is a particularly tough topic, I think, in residency programs with everything that kind of happens here. So I want to kind of honor those who might be struggling with, news of recent events as well. So anyone else on that? On what Dr. Dark just mentioned?
I just have a question. What about the money side? We got to talk. There's money, right? Somehow these guns that are out there being sold, I mean, I think, right? I mean, I'm thinking of another story in play to write, but there's got to be money involved. Dr. Dark, you were talking about like the mass shootings. Also, when those happen, don't people buy more guns? Isn't there some like, oh, let's run out and get those guns? So somebody's got to be like, aha, making some money off of this. I mean, I'm just putting it out there, but the money side, does anybody ever think about that? Or, you know?
Well, it certainly sells more papers, right? And it sells, but there's the kind of that seems to be more hype that I think is actually making the average person think like something is wrong with these policies in a way that I think when we had, just Columbine, if you will, or just Sandy Hook, now it's like you have multiples of these within spans of weeks. And it's made me think a little bit of like, will this propel that forward momentum for the average person who lives in a state where they've never thought about guns or seen guns or don't have kind of quote inner city violence, questions or concerns that many of us live with and treat patients with. But I think you're absolutely right. There's definitely a capitalist kind of churn to this, where there are quiet benefits. And it does bring up the topic, and anyone can kind of take this as well as we're thinking about what we've just asked around how these big mass shootings have impact of like how we can think about advocacy against the NRA, because that is an incredible body that has so much power. And it feels like most people don't kind of have a sense of how to even think about starting to address that aspect in a way that could really move just sensible, gun policies forward that are apolitical and that are just about protection for all individuals. Dr. Rajan, do you have any thoughts to kind of add to this portion of the discussion?
I'm just listening and just sort of echoing what's being said here. I think there is an overwhelmingness to this, which I empathize with, and I hear this a lot. Maybe my colleagues here do too, which is like, where do we start? And without going too far, I guess I'll just say, like, I think we have to think about like, what are all the ways and levers we can pull, and like we can't task our legislators to do all of it, but there are certainly some specific asks there. And then there are things, right? Like who at which level should be pushing what? We can't rely on, I don't know. So I think that's part of it, is like, who should we be asking for what, and what are the asks, and at what level, like, because it isn't like, I do think something I worry, I guess, about is that there's this idea that like one specific policy will fix all, and that's not how this works. So we have to, sorry, that's not a very articulated thought, but that's kind of where my head is at as I was listening to my colleagues here.
I want to open up either raise your virtual Zoom hand or just come off mute and ask a question. I see okay, that's one, and I'm going to go to her, but if others want to either type your question or raise your hand, we're happy to get others in the conversation.
Hi, thank you for all the information and all the work that you're doing. At the risk of being too controversial, I'm wondering where you all fall on the issue of like gun education, right? And gun safety education. Because a lot of times when in some of the spaces where we're having discourse about guns and mass shooting, the question always comes up, like, what about folks who have been disenfranchised? And what do those of us do when, I heard this a lot around the Ahmaud Arbery case and things like that. Like, it's almost like if everyone who's against us have guns, we should ourselves have guns and protect ourselves. And there's some trends on social media too, where folks are teaching young people about gun safety and purporting that this education would be part of the solution. It's not just bad guns, but it's changing our psychology about guns and things like that. So I wanted to kind of know where, what you all thought of that, and if you're familiar with these movements.
Let me jump a little bit into this one. You mentioned gun safety. I think one of the earliest gun control laws was signed by a Republican governor named Ronald Reagan in California, 1968. And that was in reaction, and it was supported by the NRA, completely in reaction to the fact that the Black Panthers were parading around the state capitol with what we would now call I guess they were rifles. They probably weren't assault rifles at that time. So yeah, there is that. The quickest way to get gun control, many of my friends have said, is that every Black man goes out and registers for their concealed carry license, and we will have gun control tomorrow. As sort of a parent, especially a Texas parent, in a place where a firearm is readily available and you are almost encouraged to walk around with it, I don't see why we shouldn't require every student to have some form of gun safety education, or even go through the class that would give you your concealed carry, so that you know how to handle a firearm, how to safely disarm one, to remove the ammunition from it, that sort of thing. I think that would be a reasonable thing to do in a place where the culture is already set up to favor guns that strong.
I agree with that. That's part of my program with kids. Safety. I think you got to put it in there. Like I said, there's guns everywhere. So, that's, part of our world. So I would say yes to that. And it's part of my program, in school program with kids,
Yeah, I think we want to be, again, sort of pulling on all levers, right? So addressing, if we think about the ecological model, really looking at what can we do, everything from policy, community, school, all the way down at the individual level to reduce it. It sort of will take that kind of collective approach in thinking.
And I like that call for us to think about the different kind of areas of the model. Just, I guess, final question, because I know today we did want to end closer to 5:30 to respect our speaker's time. If all of you could just kind of offer us some final reflections on what you would say for healthcare workers, who are the majority of people on board, what you would say for healthcare workers who are interested in supporting gun violence prevention, what they can do, how they can kind of position themselves to be able to, really do this advocacy well. Would you have any kind of last words for us to hold on to from your perspectives or narrative, policy, or research? And I will start it with Dr. Rajan.
I think first I would say is thank you for the work you do, which I can't even really imagine. I know Dr. Dark was talking about his experiences, but like really just being on the front lines of this is it's heartbreaking. And so the fact that you want to do advocacy around the space is so appreciated. And I would say, what we, I think that the hospitals and emergency rooms, that's sort of there's opportunity for intervention there. And I think that's important. But to the extent that we can also engage with your colleagues in other parts of the healthcare system, school nurses and pediatricians, to really get at some of the preventive piece earlier, so that we're working together, right? We're thinking about like normalizing safe storage and, talking through what mental wellness really looks like. And, just thinking about all of these components together, I think that kind of approach will help us at least temper the problem, right? Right now, the problem is increasing. At the very least, we want to try and like move that slope on a downward trend. So to the extent that you can do that within your space as a medical professional, and thinking about all the different individuals you work with, I think that to me feels like a really important role you could play.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all the work you're doing. Electric.
Yeah, I would just say that, what we're all doing, and I thank everybody for being here and, being on. And thank you for having me. I think just opening up the conversation and keeping the conversation alive about what we can do. I have found that when I have my little books, my early reader, a gun is not fun. If you see a gun, what to do with it. And I go out to different rallies and meetings and groups. And parents look at me and they say, well, what is that book? I said, well, I was just a little early reader. And they say, can I have one? And so I think a lot of times we just don't know how to talk about what's going on, especially with the little kids. Again, I'm, in the trenches for the kids. So talking about it as we do what we do in the healthcare world, I think whenever you come across either another colleague or community members, people visiting you, I think the pediatrician's office is a great place. People may say, wait, what? But I think the conversations have got to start, that early, and with family and everyone, extended family, the community. I think the more we can kind of engage people in this and in the healthcare world, wherever it takes you, wherever it leads you, I would say, engage, when you can in the conversation, the one we're having today.
That's awesome.
Keep it
I'm
up.
looking at Dr. Braganza and others in the peds field and thinking about the importance of the work that they're doing. Dr. Dark.
All right, so the question of how do you get involved, or how do you even approach this? Number one, I need you to remember your role as a physician, and this is going to be in contrast to what the NRA and probably some of your other physicians is going to say, because you might be a pediatrician. Well, what's the number one cause of death for kids? You might be an internal medicine doctor that wants to order an MRI for somebody, but can't because they have a bullet in their arm somewhere from years ago. You might be a psychiatrist and your patient has mental health issues. You might be a PM&R doc and you need to do rehab after someone gets shot, or you need to do something else along the line. Like you might be infectious disease and your patient has multi-drug resistant UTIs because they're paraplegic from a gunshot wound. It's not just the trauma surgeons and the ER doctors. It's everybody in the space. This is your lane as well. That's the first thing. The second thing is this: we as physicians are often given a lot of credibility just because of the degree behind our name. Let us use our power and our advocacy voice to lift up the voices of people that are marginalized and held quiet the rest of the time. The voices of our patients, the voices of our community. That's the challenge that I think is really for us to be humble in who we are, so that we can amplify the voice of other people that really live the experience that we don't necessarily live.
That is a word. I'm thinking about a lot of what you have shared, particularly what Dr. Rajan just talked about of green space is gun violence and all the different ways that we need to think about approaching this problem. I want to thank you all for being on today. For our listeners, I'm just going to remind us of a couple of housekeeping items. Please don't forget to fill the feedback survey. It helps us to make sure that we are designing rounds that are kind of, what you'd like to hear. We won't meet in June because of all of the different activities that we have going, but we will meet again in July. And Jessica has put in a tremendous number of resources, including things like joining the advocacy efforts of Doctors for America, including sharing Electric's resources that you could share with your pediatric colleagues and others. And so I just want to encourage you, when you get the follow-up email, to just take a look at that, because even doing one of these quote unquote small actions, if you think about, multiplying it across many of us, can have a true impact. I want to thank our speakers in particular for bringing their different perspectives and for, I think, being provocative and thinking about this issue from different angles. And we will see you all in July. Everyone, please stay safe and take care of yourselves. Bye, everyone.
Bye.